Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I decided to do a very theoretical video. So theoretical, it's something that really cannot be explained by humans just yet. Queen endgames. Queen endgames are notoriously complicated because of perpetual checking possibilities, and there are a lot of variations that you have to calculate, and there's a lot of strategy behind them, and they're very complicated, very mysterious. uh, Us being in the 21st century, we have the table base, and the table base has solved these positions, for instance. I know for a fact that the table base gives these types of positions drawn with the g-pawn. But before we get into that, let's just talk about the strategy of both sides. So white's pawn is going down the board, and the black queen will harass the white king with checks. So let's assume that let's set this up. Let's assume we have a position like this. Sorry for the amount of time this is taking. Let's see, where's the queen going? Let's put the queen, for instance, on. Let's put the queen, for example, on g6 in this position, and we are going to put our queen onto d5, giving a check. I'm trying not to really blunder anything. So let's say we have this position. So now our pawn is defended by the queen, and the white is eventually going to get a position like this. He's going to march around his pawn, his pawn down the board. The thing is that that is quite easy to do because the king can escape the checks because he'll have an extra rank. But on the last rank, it's always the most complicated to actually push the pawn one more square because there always will be some sort of harassment of the king. For example, in a move like king h8, there will be the move queen to e5 pinning the pawn, for example. I mean, there are other moves. Maybe a move like queen h1 check is also possible. That is part of the reason why the black king, when defending these positions with the pawn on its 7th rank, has to be on the farthest possible position away from the pawn. So the opposite corner. Because the king is on the opposite corner, it's very difficult for white to give counter checks. So let's assume that the king were somewhere close to. Let's assume that this king were on d7, for instance, right? White would make the move queen f7, and black is basically forced to exchange queens. And once the queens are off the board, then there are no complications. White promotes his pawn. And that's the reason why the king has to be so far away from the pawn, is because it has to play against. It's very difficult for white to create any sort of counter checks or counter pins, where it creates threats against both the opposing king and queen. That's why the strategy to attempt to win this position is quite crazy. I don't believe these positions are possible to defend by humans, at least, especially when humans will be thinking so long. Eventually, there will be some sort of time pressure. And, when there's under time pressure, they're going to blunder some sort of counter check. The strategy that white needs to do here is to actually run the king all the way down the board somewhere and attempt to give some sort of counter check once his king runs all the way down. So let's assume that the king came to the h1 square, for example, and the only check that black had was a check on the first rank. Then white can block, and there's the pin. So white's going to try to get kind of close to the enemy king. Now, the table base, I guess, and the computers have proved that black can still maybe draw this, at least with a g pawn. I'm not so sure about other pawns. I know with an h pawn also. I think with a f pawn, or let's just say bishop's pawn, it really doesn't matter. It's actually by winning by force. But it's highly theoretical. The way how you should practice these queen endgames is to play against the computer or against a friend of yours, and at least try to win them. I mean, I don't understand how someone's going to defend them, but you can try out these strategies. It's a lot of fun, when you're on the train, for example, and you have to get to a destination. Put up a position like this and have some fun with the computer. One that I always did was to keep myself sharp was, well, when I was only a developing player, like many years ago, I used to do queen versus rook, and once I got good at that, then I got into the more complicated examples, which I still do, like queen versus a rook and pawn in like the fortress, when there's a fortress position, but it's possible to break through. So I'm going to just try to create some sample variations. And the reason why the bishop's pawn is by far the best is because there is a lot of hiding space for the king. So let's assume that the move king h8 were played, and if black were to make a move like queen e5, if this were a bishop's pawn, then maybe the move king sidestepping even more would be possible, just to get off of the pin. And that's why the bishop's pawns are always the best. Central pawns are always also very good. The problem, though, is that there's a checking space from the other side, though. So let's assume that we had a central pawn and the king were to sidestep somewhere. Maybe the queen can harass the king from both sides and all diagonals, rather than when it's a bishop's pawn, it only harasses it from one side and diagonals. So that is why it is very a very theoretical position. There are a lot of things wacky theories I've heard about queen endgames. At the very least, I have heard that. Let's see, how do we do this? I heard that when we have h pawns, a g and h pawn, it's a draw. I've heard some theory like this, as long as the king is in front of the pawns. If the king's not in front of the pawns, it's winning. By the way, if you could get your king in front of the pawn when a queen endgame is happening, then it's going to probably be a draw. But if you can't, then the next best defense is always keep the king as far away as possible from the pawn, so in the opposite corner. And that's also one of the advantages of having a central pawn. It's that it's very difficult to actually hide your king from checks from a central pawn. Some central pawn positions are winning also, but it's always very difficult to say. I've heard some crazy theories about queen endgames that this position's a draw. I don't know if a human could defend this position. I didn't even know if it's a draw. I mean, some grandmaster told me this. I forget who, but remember, we're talking about theoretical chess, and there's also the practical chess. In practical terms, these positions are all losing, probably. It's also only when there's a G and H pawns, or if there are F and G pawns, it's winning because the king has more hiding places from the queen. And that's why queen endgames are so annoying, because there's always you always have to find hiding places for the queen, and you have to be careful not to blunder perpetual checks. It has happened before that I was recently observing a game where both sides were under extreme time pressure. Now, first of all, I can imagine how stressful it is to defend a queen endgame under extreme time pressure, because you're probably going to lose, even if it's a quote-unquote drawn endgame, theoretically. But the thing is that one side kind of kept his king and queen on the same file, and there was just a bunch of checks that would skewer his king queen. So when the king would move away, then a check would come from the other side, so the king had to move away to keep defense of the queen, and it ended up being a draw. And it was quite an important game that I recently saw. You got to be extra concentrated. Also, queen endgames are very unfortunate because you're going to get tired. There have been 200 plus move games in queen endgames, especially under, I don't know about 200, maybe 200. I could believe it. It's very possible. Definitely in top level chess, this has happened. It definitely does take a while it definitely does take a while, for example, to push your, let's just set up the original position that I had. It definitely does take a while to set up your, just do something like this. It definitely does take a while to get their G pawn to the seventh rank, and that is possible to do. The question is it possible to promote it? But you have to do things where your king evades all the checks, and you get a position where checks are no longer possible. And that is why these Queen Endgames are just so crazy. This is very theoretical, and of course, if you have anything else that you want me to show, please leave in the comments. All right, thanks.